And we believe that if our efforts are according to the Scriptures, then God will be able to add His blessings to them. Earlier this year, the South Warren congregation in Bowling Green, Kentucky, decided they would use a whole month of their Sunday morning services to devote to the subject of stewardship. More specifically, the subject, stewardship begins with me. And they invited people who had either been educated, trained at preacher training schools, or who are actively involved in that work presently. The first speaker was Brother Jerry Carmichael, who's done a tremendous amount of mission work in northern Kentucky, establishing a congregation that is just south of the Ark up there in Cincinnati, and did a tremendous work. Brother Carmichael was a graduate of the East Tennessee School of Preaching, now the Southeast Institute. The second speaker was one of our instructors from the Nashville School of Preaching. And then the third was myself. The fourth, and to finish out, one of our students, and then our director. The subject was stewardship, and I began to think about some of the subjects that they would probably use, and some subjects will come to your mind. One of the classics would be the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. He became Potiphar's slave, but he was a steward. Those words can be interchanged. They're just not as popular to use them, or maybe as appropriate. In the labor industry, there is a steward system. If you have ever been in a work situation where you had a local steward, a shop steward, you might have an area steward, we normally wouldn't refer to them as slaves, but there's a sense in which they are. They're a slave, or they're dedicated to the employee. There was also a concept that I came across when I was doing some research about how elders are stewards. That's pretty obvious. A steward is one who's taking care of something that doesn't really belong to them. They're responsible for it. And the church, the local church, doesn't belong to the eldership. It doesn't belong to you or me. It belongs to Christ. But they are the caretakers. They are the shepherds. They are looking after us, and they are responsible for us in a sense. I found that in 2010, Harding College conducted a lectureship, and the subject of the entire lectureship was stewardship. And I came across lectures given by preachers on the subject of elders, the subject of your personal possessions, and all kinds of things that you would normally think about when you're thinking about stewardship. But I came across one by Brother Jack Lewis, Stewardship of the Mind, M-I-N-D, mind. And that was interesting to me. And I began to look at that and to make some notes and to prepare some remarks along that line. So I would give Brother Lewis, he's already gone on now, I would give him credit for causing me to think along these lines. First of all, I want to talk just a little bit about stewardship as I've done up to this point. I want to make some remarks about how we are to be stewards of our minds. If it is the case that we are to be faithful stewards, and Luke chapter 12 points that out, as Brother Coley read, to start with, God owns everything. It's all His. And we are the caretakers. In fact, we're reminded that we brought nothing into this world. There was no package of benefits that came with us. There were no salary guarantees. We brought nothing into this world. Even though we were a bundle of joy, most likely, to our parents. That may have changed and been adjusted a little bit after we got a little age on us. But basically, we brought nothing, and we will take nothing when we leave. And you've heard all the anecdotal information and jokes and things of that nature about putting things in the casket and cash or a good check or those types of things. So I'll not go there. But basically, we will take nothing except the treasure we've laid up in heaven. And this is not our subject for today. We've heard these subjects, the subject about the parables. That's another tremendous lesson on the subject of stewardship and how we are responsible, regardless of our ability. Not everybody's equal. You ask a teacher in our public school system. I expect this to be the case. I haven't asked one recently. But I expect this to be the case. Are all of your students, we're fixing to start a new school year, will all of your students be at the same level of understanding, of knowledge, of information? Probably not. Some will be farther along than others. Some who are noted to do extra work outside the assigned subjects, they may be a little bit farther ahead than some of the others. So we don't really have an equality there. Can you think of any situation, though, in the business world, for example? Are all businesses, if you get a net worth of a business, are they all the same? Do they all have the same percentage of debt if there is? Well, no. There's a lot of factors that come into play. In this room, for example, all you have to do is just acknowledge that even though we have some similarities, even though there are some things common with us, we're different. We're just different. We have different opportunities. We've had different opportunities. We have differing perspectives on things. But if it's something that really doesn't make a lot of difference in life, we can be different. We can have different sports teams. We can have some similarities, but we can be different. So, Brother Lewis pointed this out. Brother Lewis was an educator for more than 50 years. And he pointed this out when he's dealing with his students. They're not the same. And you learn that early on. And so therefore, at that particular level, there may not be as much accommodation. I found that when I went to college, the length of time I was there, now they would work with you up to a point, but they expected you to be at a certain level by the time you got there. And I don't recall there being a remedial atmosphere at David Lipscomb College when I attended back in the early 70s. Now, maybe somebody would work with you, but you came in at the level you were, and hopefully you would build from that. I'm not knocking or discounting the fact that sometimes we need to have remedial instruction to help people along. And might add this, we all need that, really, to help ourselves along. Maybe from outside sources. Maybe someone who will encourage us to try just a little bit harder. I remember seeing an interview with William Faulkner. That name will be familiar probably to most of us from literature. William Faulkner was asked some things about being a writer. And he said the important thing is not really to compare yourself to some other writer and say, I want to be like them. He said, you probably can't. I'm paraphrasing what he said. He said, you compete with yourself. Let that be your main competition. You compete with yourself. His point was, try to get better than you are. And so, instead of me trying to compete with you, me trying to compete with your stable of preachers that we have here, well, I can't. I just can't. I'm doing some calculating in my head right now. If you hear a noise, I think I'm older than they are. So in that way, I can't compete with them. And I'm not going to try to. I'm just going to try to get better than I am right now. And I challenge you to do that. I'm not saying that you need improvement. I'm not trying to point out any area I don't know. But I would amen to what Mr. Faulkner said. And I know we have people that we look up to. We all need to be mentored in some way or another. One of our teachers, their PhD dissertation had to do with the subject, is there a mentoring process for people who graduate from preacher training schools? And his point was there needs to be. There needs to be. And he was encouraging preacher training schools to try to implement something like that if they didn't. So we all need, that's pretty well understood. We all need someone that we can look to and that will encourage us and that will tell us when we need to be realigned, as we mentioned in the previous hour, if they know. I don't want people who know just as much as I do giving me instruction. I assume that everybody here knows at least as much as I do, and most of you know more. I just make that assumption. I don't go into a room or a situation or a circumstance considering where I think, well, I'm so far ahead of them it's not even funny. No, I assume you know at least on any given subject that I might be interested in and that you might be interested in. You know at least as much as I do, and probably more. So I'm standing before you today encouraging myself and encouraging you to simply try to improve and get better than we are right now. Not suggesting, well, you've got plenty of room for improvement. No, just simply to get better than we are. And my point is this, and I borrowed this from Brother Lewis. When it comes to talents, and we all have some, and he reverts back to the parable of the talents, you either use it or you lose it. And that had reference to the 1 talent man. The other gained, had more, theoretically, the one talent, didn't use it, buried it in the ground, and it didn't even draw interest. Buried it in the ground, and what happened to it? He lost it. So that was Brother Lewis's point. Whatever level you are at education, whatever level you are and capacity you have to understand, use it. Develop it. Get better than you are. Or ultimately you will find yourself, and I will find myself, at a loss. The epistle to the Hebrews speaks of those who, by reason of the use of their senses, trained to discern between good and evil. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14. The point is, if you see someone who is a musician, the likelihood they have trained their ear to recognize even the slightest deviation in note and quality. I saw a little bit of one of those period films the other day, and this was an old musician, composer, and he had not done any work in a while. He was getting on in years, and this younger fella came to be his protege, his apprentice. Now this younger fella, he knew music, and what this older fella did is he had this tune in his mind. And you know how, and I'm not going to imitate it now, it wouldn't be decent and it wouldn't be in order. But you know how we can hum a tune, and we now I don't create new tunes in my mind, but a lot of people do. But I'll hear something on the radio or an old song that was popular when Cynthia and I were dating. We run across those once in a while. They did have music back then. And I'll get that in my mind, and I cannot get it out of my mind. There is a tune, and I've not investigated it too much because I'm afraid I'll find something that I'll be ashamed of. But there was a tune based on the children of Israel being in Babylonian captivity. And it was taken from a passage in the Old Testament. And it included these words, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat down, and they had visions of Zion." They had visions of home. The Babylonians asked them, "Sing us one of your songs." And they came back with this: "How can we sing the songs of God in the land in the shape that we're in?" And that particular tune, I got it in my mind. It's in there right now. I've got it kind of shoved over to the back. But you know how that works, probably. You get something in your mind. You don't try to articulate it. I found this out the hard way back. I may have told some of you this. When we first began to Zoom services, and Cynthia would be at her laptop and I would be at the desktop. And we wanted to participate, so I put my headphones on and I was singing, trying to sing along with the singing. Well, we don't get the signal at the same time. She's in the den, I'm in the area where the desktop is. And that lasted about half a verse. She came in, got my attention. "Stop. Please stop." But if you've ever tried to sing with headphones on, I'd hate to be the one trying to listen to it. I sound pretty good. But I had to stop out of respect for her because she wanted to participate in the service as well. Now, why we didn't just go to one computer or the other and leave the other one out, it's a mystery to me. We just didn't do it. My point is, someone who is musically inclined, they know And what I was fixing to tell about that little period piece is this old composer just kind of hummed out loud this tune. And he wanted that young apprentice to write it down in musical notes. And I thought, I want to see this. But he did. The young man did. And he was at an old piano, and the old man wanted him, let me hear that. I thought, I want to see this. Because that sort of thing, it makes sense to the song leaders, but it doesn't make sense to me because I am not one. I'm more of an imitator when it comes to leading singing. I can lead a song that I've heard before, sometimes many times, but that's about it. It would mean something to the song leaders who are musically inclined, but not to me. But that young man did. Why? Because he was trained. He trained his mind. He was trying to be better than he was. And the old fella who was nearly finished with this course, with this life, he was still trying to come up with something new. And we acknowledge that when people that they're not ready to give up. As long as they're able, they're not ready to give up. So the point is this: the trained mind will serve the Lord better. It will be better. It'll be as good as it can be, and all while the training is taking place, it'll be getting better and better. Now, the point is this, among other things: if the Lord requires that a man account for what he has done with his time and with his money, would you agree that we will give account someday on the judgment day for how we have dealt with the time that we have, the time that we've been given? It's a gift of God. The time that we have is a gift. The possessions that we have are made possible. We didn't create them. By a process of circumstances and situations and work and contributions perhaps from others, we're able to manage what we have. If we will give account for all of that, don't you think that we will give account for how we have utilized our mental faculties? The blessing of such a mind as we have, we will give account for that. So, we really can be better than we are. Thomas Edison said that genius is 2% inspiration and 98% preparation. I've heard people say perspiration, but I think Edison said preparation. 2% inspiration, 98% preparation. It was said that Thomas Edison's son said about his father, quote, well, maybe he was a genius, but few men ever worked harder at being one. It just didn't come naturally for him. What do you imagine this world would be like if all the evil that's been done throughout history out of ignorance, out of being ill-informed, what if all that was paraded before us? What a shocking show that would be. Back in the New Testament, Romans chapter 10, the Jews were described as having zeal without knowledge. You're familiar with that. Ignorant of God's righteousness, they were set to establish their own righteousness, and they failed to attain the righteousness of God. Romans 10 and verse 3. In Acts 3 and verse 17, we're talking about ignorance now and what ignorance has done, and I might add, continues to do. Peter informs us in Acts 3 that the Jews crucified Jesus in ignorance. In ignorance. Jesus' prayer for his murderers was on this basis. In Luke chapter 23, he said, "They know not what they do." What is another way of describing someone who knows not? Well, they're ignorant. Maybe we don't like to be referred to as ignorant. Maybe that's an off-putting term, but it's about the same as not knowing. Probably is about the same. You remember in 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul, as a persecutor, acted ignorantly in unbelief. In Ephesians 4 and verse 18, the Gentiles were alienated from God through ignorance. And before their obedience, they lived in lust in their ignorance. 1 Peter 1 and verse 14. Again, if all the ignorance that is characterized epics and episodes in this world were somehow paraded before us, we would be shocked. So that brings us to this point. The invitation of the gospel is a call to use the mind. The best possible use of our mind is to consider what God has done for us. And every time I do that, I'm ashamed. I'm not ashamed of you. I'm not ashamed of my country. I'm not ashamed of the world that we live in. I'm ashamed of me. I'm just ashamed of myself. That while I was yet a sinner prospectively, Jesus died for me. Do you not perceive? Jesus asked in Matthew 16:18. Matthew 11 and verse 29. And before that he says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest." And he concludes that with, "Come, learn of me." You are, because you're here today, whether you're a member here or you're visiting with us, you are here because of your interest, and it's in varying levels. If you've been a member of the body of Christ for a long time, your interest in these matters a bit farther along than someone who might be hearing something like this for the first time. Not because I've said anything that's remarkable, simply you have not been directed in your thinking in this way, maybe in a while or if ever. There is a reasoning element in evangelism. There is a reasoning element in considering what God would have us to do. And if you're not a Christian, it's a matter of reasoning. You look and see where you are. You look and see where you are going on the path that you're going, and you look and see where this is going to lead you. And if it's leading you to God and ultimately to heaven, marvelous. If the path you're on is not currently leading you in that direction, we would offer you an invitation before we go out in the elements today to come in faith, repenting of your sins, confessing your faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, to be baptized so that the Lord can add you to the church. If somehow or another in your life as a Christian you've gotten out of alignment, we would encourage you to do what's necessary to get that fixed. And if it would warrant a public confession, we urge you to do that before there is continual wear and tear, and you'll get to the point of total breakdown and ultimately will be lost. We can help anyone. Please come while we stand, while we sing.